Thank you, and welcome to you all. It's great to be back here. The co-sponsor of this event is the Yitzhak Rabin Center. We are here on the more or less 19th anniversary of his assassination, and it's in his honor and his memory to some extent that the evening is occurring. The Rabin Center, if you haven't been there, is a beautiful place in Ramat Aviv in Tel Aviv. It was designed by Moshe Safdie, the Canadian-Israeli architect. And it's sort of I think it's the only official attempt at maintaining the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. It's a museum and it's archives and there are classes and I've been at events there and it's got an educational department and so forth. And it asserts that it is, reinforcing democratic values and promoting tolerance and so forth. Originally, I'm sure you know, Dennis Ross was supposed to be with us tonight. He is very ill and couldn't come. And we were very lucky that Aaron David Miller is going to take his place. So let me introduce the two people that I'll be talking with tonight. The first is Dalia Rabin, the Prime Minister's daughter. She's a lawyer. She has a law degree from Tel Aviv University. And she was elected to the Knesset in the late 90s. She served on what was then the Center Party ticket. That party fell apart. She moved to the Labor Party, became the Deputy Defense Minister, and then left politics to sort of save the nascent Rabin Center and build it up into what it is today, and that's what she's been doing pretty much ever since. Aaron David Miller, I'm sure you've all read and seen him. He was a key member of the peace team for many years, both Democratic and Republican administrations. He is now Vice President for so-called New Initiatives and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. And he has a new book out called End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. He also wrote a terrific book about the peace process called The Too Promised Land, or Much Too Promised Land. It's not in front of me, forgive me, Aaron, but it was a great book. And he's frequently on all of the shows you'd expect such a person to be on, and contributing to the various publications that you'd expect such a person to contribute to. So, would you two both join me, please? Come outside. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm in the middle.
You're in the middle. Stop lying. You start out lying, it's not good.
That's true.
So, Dalia, I'm going to start with you. And as I said, I have a very strong memory of your father's assassination. I was a reporter in Israel at the time for the Boston Globe, and actually stood outside Ichilov Hospital when he was in there, waiting to find out what was going on. And when Ethan Haber, his aide, came out to announce that he had died, I was completely and totally stunned for some reason, standing out there. Word had spread that he was just injured and he was going to be okay. And when Eitan came to the words Moto Shel, it was with great sadness and graveness that we announced the death of Moto Shel, my sort of face fell, my pen fell from my notebook, and it actually has been recorded because Channel 2 I was next to him. And so it means an enormous amount to me that you're here on this anniversary. So I think I want to start out by asking you to talk a little bit about his legacy, as thoughtfully as you can.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming. I was raised being grateful for every gesture and never taking anything for granted. So I appreciate those who came. And about my father's legacy, I think it's quite clear today, and it's getting clearer 20 years after. First of all, he was very committed to the Israeli people. He was a very committed leader, very modest, very sincere. And his vision was to make Israel a good place to live in. He did not want Israel to be just a place to come and die for. He wanted to put an end to the dispute, to the ongoing wars. He was a warrior for so many years, and he knew so well the price of wars, and that actually wars are always bad for both sides. Even the biggest victory, you pay a big price. And he was very well known for his famous speech on Mount Scopus when in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem University decided to honor him with a philosophy doctorate, honorary doctorate. He gave the famous speech about the spirit of the Israeli army, the difference between the Israeli army and the other armies, that people who come to fight are actually people who come from home and go back home after the war. They are not professional warriors. And then when he was second time elected as prime minister, his goal was to make peace with the Palestinians after the big breakthrough of Begin in 1979, making peace with Egypt. He thought it was a very, very right move, and peace was a platform to make Israel a good place to live in. Because when you don't have to invest in military, you can invest in education, in infrastructure, in industry, and this was the big agenda, change of priorities. And for that, to make this happen, we had to make peace with the Palestinians, which meant giving up land, which was not acceptable by the extreme right, by the religious extreme right. And they started a campaign calling him traitor, inciting against him personally, making him the target. And it was clear that at the end of the day, somebody will feel that he is backed enough, that he has enough backing to shoot the prime minister in the back. And that's what happened that terrible night, almost 20 years ago, November 4th, 1995, in a peace rally in the center of Tel Aviv, where everybody was raving and so happy, and there was a feeling of hope in Israel. There was a feeling of change, and he was gunned down. And 20 years later, we all know where we are.
Aaron, I want you to also, I want to ask you a couple of things. One is that we were talking about the fact that, in fact, your family has known the Rabin family since you were a child. And so you knew Yitzhak Rabin not just in your professional capacity when you were on the peace team, but a little bit as a kid. And you've just written a book about leadership. So tell us a little bit about how you view him and his legacy.
I miss him, first of all. And let me say, it's an honor to be here with both Ethan and Dalia. They remind me of a bygone time, which is going to be very difficult to recapture and regain. A rare moment, the 1990s, the only decade in the last century, the only one in which there was no major war between Israel and its neighbors. 1948, 56, 67, 73, 82. The 90s came and went without a major conflagration with respect to conventional war. One of the reasons was because of your father. And I will say, I will say that Yitzhak Rabin had the authority and legitimacy to do what very few other Israeli leaders had done. I agree with Dalia. I think he really understood that peacemaking was more than about formal agreements. It, in many respects, was the key to regional legitimization and the key to normalcy. I mean, after all, the whole purpose of political Zionism was to make was to create some measure of normalcy for the Jewish people, and that required some measure of accommodation. At the same time, he was a pragmatic hawk. And I think this was the key to his success. Visionary in many respects, but someone who was very tough and very tough-minded. I also don't think anyone subsequently, to make peace, to make tough decisions, to take tough decisions, you need two things. You need incentive and you need capacity. You could argue that Yitzhak Rabin was the last Israeli leader that had both. Right now, and again, this is not a question of Likud or Labor, Republican or Democrat, it's just an observation. You could make the argument that Benjamin Netanyahu has the capacity but not the incentive, and Mahmoud Abbas has the incentive, but perhaps not the capacity. Rabin had both. And if I could change one thing, actually two things, if there's no rewind button on history, but if I could change two things, and I've worked for Republicans and Democrats, I've voted for Republicans and Democrats, but if I could change two things, if I had the power to change two things, we would be having a different conversation. Number one, Rabin would not have been murdered. And number two, we would have had an administration in Washington, and I had great admiration for Bill Clinton, tremendous admiration, but had Bush 41 and Jim Baker had another 4 years, and you put Baker and Rabin together, we would have had one agreement. I don't know whether it would be between Israel and Syria or Israel and the Palestinians. The nature of the conversation tonight is a counterfactual. I concede that. But the nature of the conversation tonight would be quite different. This is about, in the end, last point, leadership. You want a two-state solution? You produce leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their constituencies. Leaders that have vision and the pragmatic sense of how to achieve that vision. And that is what's missing here. It's not the absence of creative, clever fixes. We have drawers full of those. It's political will and political skill.
Well, let me add one thought, which is that when Prime Minister Rabin was at that peace rally, his numbers were not good. And there was an election coming up, and it is not impossible to imagine that he would have lost that election. But we can move from history, and I want to move to what's happening in Israel today. I think rather shockingly and unexpectedly, Prime Minister Netanyahu has called for new elections 2 years into, 2 years early. I think my sense, and I'm not there, as you know, I'm here, is that people are a little bewildered by this, a little unhappy about it, and I don't know whether that means that they'll take out their unhappiness on him, or because they're so unhappy with the situation that he's the guy they're going to re-elect and move the country still further to the right without the centrist tendencies that Yesh Atid and Hatznua represent, Tzipi Livni and Lapid. So, what do you think, Dalia? I mean, nobody knows. Everyone says it's stupid to predict anything. But, here we are. It's 3 or 4 months from now. What's going to happen? Do you guess?
I will not try to guess what's going to happen because this is too dangerous. But I will try to analyze the situation.
Fine.
This government was formed, the coalition was formed from different parties. Lapid represented the aftermath of the social revolution. Mm-hmm. He was elected on this ticket. Tzipi Livni was she joined the coalition to take care of the peace process, of the negotiation. Both of them never implemented, never achieved their agenda. And now let's think about the last summer. The last war. Netanyahu was handling the war very carefully. So he was fiercely attacked by extreme right.
Right.
So he felt that he's losing everything because there was nothing significantly done in the economic sphere. There is no negotiations whatsoever. We are in a very bad situation relationship-wise with the United States, And he's being attacked by his own constituency in the right, in the extreme right. So I think he felt that he is trapped, and his way out of it was to declare election. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, but we have elections, so it's a source of hope for a change.
Is that how you feel?
Yeah.
Aaron, are you hopeful about these elections?
Well, my own view of this entire region has been, ever since leaving government in '03, which is 11 years now, has been, and these are my words, annoyingly negative, and I apologize for that. But, I agree with Groucho Marx, who in Duck Soup said, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" I know what I see, and I haven't lost hope, but I refuse to engage any longer in illusions. And there's a big distinction between looking at the world the way you want it to be rather than the way it actually is. And the point of view of a wise policy, whether for Israel or the United States, is first and foremost looking at the world the way it is. My view right now, if elections were held, the prime minister would win. He's now the second longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, save David Ben-Gurion. There doesn't appear to be anyone who has his political skills, his security credentials, and a track record for winning. You have a country that has clearly moved to the right. There are internal factors that are responsible for that, but also the neighborhood is melting down. And whatever Israel's sins and transgressions may be, the most effective talking points for a strong U.S. Israeli relationship and for the prime minister's conception of the world is the behavior of Israel's neighbors. ISIS, Assad, Sisi, the mullahs in Iran. Relatively speaking, the Israelis still belong in the good guy column. So the Arabs, in many respects, become the most effective set of talking points.
Actually, I want to ask you about
for an
Abbas.
Israeli prime minister and for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. But again, a lot of wild cards in this election.
Let me ask you about President Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, it's in a way ISIS and Sisi are easy targets. Abbas is a more complicated target. More complicated topic. He, in many ways, has been wonderful to talk of peace, and a lot of things he said. 2 years ago, he went on Israeli TV and he said, listen, I'm from Safed, but I don't want to go back. I don't deserve to go back. And all of that. The law of return is not for everybody. But he is now, on the other hand, talking about Israel being a source of genocide and Al-Aqsa is in danger and all that sort of thing, and helping, I think, Netanyahu make the argument that there is no peace partner. What's your view on this?
The argument that he is the best partner, we dealt with Arafat for a long time.
That was rough.
And the paradox of Yasser Arafat is that you couldn't do the deal with him, and you couldn't do the deal without him. Right. And that gets to the discussion of Abbas. Remember, it's not just incentive, it's capacity. No matter what you want, you have to have the capacity to deliver. And this man now presides over, and I've said this many times, a fundamental division within the Palestinian national movement. It literally looks like Noah's Ark. There are two of everything. Two constitutions, two sets of security services, two respective patrons, two different visions of where the putative state of Palestine is and should be and what it should be. And I don't represent the government of Israel, but this I know, that maintaining a monopoly over the forces of violence within your society is probably the most important characteristic of sovereignty. Unless you have it, unless you control all of the guns, you can't have the respect of your neighbors, let alone your own constituents. So that's Abbas's problem. It's a thought experiment. Under certain circumstances, perhaps, but I don't see that. And this is, I think, part of the problem. So the default position for this man, no negotiations. He certainly doesn't believe in the armed struggle. So then you triangulate. You go to New York, the UN, the international community. You try to get the Swedes, the Brits, the French, and the Spanish to create parliamentary legitimacy.
But what about this effort at Palestinian unity that Israel was so opposed to. Dalia, do you think that it's crazy for the PA to try to cut a deal with Hamas? Is it an insane notion?
No. And during the last war, we were yearning to deal with Abu Mazen about Gaza because of the Egyptians' approach. And, you know, looking back, like Aaron said about looking back at the negotiations with Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat was supposedly strong enough to bring the goods. This is why my father decided to deal with him. Not that he liked him, not that he thought that he is a dove on the tree. He thought that this guy can bring the goods. He could control both all the different militias and Hamas. And when you look at what happened actually during the peace process in Israel, the wave of terror during 95, Arafat was not bringing the goods. So it's difficult to say. Abu Mazen at the beginning looked more reliable, not as strong and as charismatic as Arafat, but there were times of cooperation. During the time of the Prime Minister, what was his name? The American.
Oh, you mean Fayyad?
Salam
Fayyad, yeah.
There was a full cooperation with the support of the Americans, and there was no terror.
Right.
And after my father's assassination, there was no terror. Arafat was controlling. So it's difficult to say, and I think we made a lot of mistakes during the last years, letting go of Hamas prisoners instead of giving Abu Mazen the credit, and doing all kinds of things that strengthened Hamas. And when it came to the fact that we had to deal with somebody, in spite of opposing this the agreement between Hamas and PLO, we wanted to deal with Abu Mazen about trying to put an end to this war and getting something out of it. At the end of it, there was nothing done, and we got out of this war with nothing.
Aaron?
Well, I was just going to tell a Rabin story because it's on point. You know, Rabin was first and foremost an analyst, and he would gather with us, minus the Secretary of State, for these sessions. And I remember one at the Washington Hilton in the spring of '93. And the Prime Minister was there, chain smoking, contrary to hotel policy. And we were sitting there talking about whether Jordan should be an interlocutor or the West Bank and Gaza. And it was fascinating to watch the Prime Minister's body language. And Sam Lewis, the late Sam Lewis, former ambassador to Israel, said to the Prime Minister, "You seem to be sane, Mr. Prime Minister. Remember, this is probably March. This was March of '93.
Before the...
The 6 months
Right.
before.
But contacts were already
Right.
in the works.
So I'm not sure he knew.
Yeah,
Oh, he knew.
But I'm not sure he knew how serious it was.
He
is what I mean.
knew. And Sam Lewis said to him, well, you seem to be saying that if Jordan isn't an interlocutor and the West Bankers and Gazans are too weak, then the only alternative was the PLO.
Right.
He didn't answer, but it was absolutely clear. We thought about this in hindsight, that he already was thinking beyond this. Now, whether or not he could have brought himself ultimately, as secret negotiations between Israel and the PLO was responsible for Oslo, whether or not he would have come to the conclusion that a unified Palestinian polity was the only way ever to get what he really wanted, was security and one Palestinian leader in control of all the guns, I don't know. but it's a fascinating conjecture.
What's your view of Hamas, about how much one should deal with Hamas?
You know, I think that we have our constraints. I mean, the United States has no problems, let's be very clear, dealing with the worst kind of insurgent groups. We deal with groups in Afghanistan and in Iraq that have literally the blood of American soldiers on their hands. We, for a number of reasons, have chosen not to deal with Hamas, either through cutouts or directly, in part because we don't want to weaken Hamas. In part, obviously, there are, by statute and legislation, there's a prohibition, but there are ways around this, should we want to. The question is, what is the point? Is it a key to an empty room? I mean, I could see a situation developing if, in fact, there was prospects and promise of some sort of an agreement for some deal to be concocted. But right now, it seems to me there isn't. And no one in Jerusalem, Ramallah, or Washington has the will or the skill to figure out a way to put this Humpty Dumpty back together again.
For some 7 or 8 years now, basically since Hamas took power in Gaza, I guess that's 8 years, the policy of Israel has been to isolate it. Do you have a view on whether it would have made more sense to do something else, to try to allow trade so that the tradesmen and the more educated people who live there would form a natural political counterforce to Hamas? Is that a crazy idea?
If you ask about my personal idea,
That's all I'm here to ask
my
about.
personal approach, I think at the end of the day we dealt with Hamas and we let merchandise in and out of Gaza. And I think improving the life of the people in Gaza would have bettered the situation. And at the end of the day, we'll have to deal with them. And when my father took over, he said, I'll never speak to Yasser Arafat, never. So never say never, because reality on the ground dictates things that you don't take into consideration. And sometimes reality is different. And
let me ask you about something else, Dalia, and also Aaron, but let me start with you, Dalia, and that is that it seems like Israel's image is losing steam in the West, certainly in Europe. I mean, that's quite easy to show. In the United States, the data are messier. I mean, broadly, it's still a very popular place, but younger people, Democrats, intellectuals have become more critical than at any time in a long time. How serious is it, do you think?
it's serious. And if you just compare to my father's approach and to my father's relationship with the United States first and foremost, and with all the rest of the world, then it speaks for itself. I don't have to say anything else. I don't think it's for any favor that we get to that point.
But why is it? I mean, maybe the simple answer is that Israel is turning to the right. And Beregel Echad, and can you tell me briefly, why is Israel been so consistently turning to the right? Why do you think?
When, during Barak's time, there was the failure of Camp David II. And the Labour Party people came out of Camp David and said, we have no partner. This, I think, to my opinion, was the turning point in the approach of the Israeli society. Because if Labour Party leaders say that we don't have a partner, then let's choose the force and the military, and let's go back to fighting everybody. And the Israeli society that even beforehand, had a tendency to support the right. This
Well, the Second Intifada followed pretty shortly after what
yeah,
you're
my
describing.
father, if you look at the outcome of the election of '92, it was very
close.
And it was him being Mr. Security that broke and drove people from the right to support him.
Right.
And the same happened
Elena
with Barak in '99. Because he was considered to be Mr. Security, who will be able to take care of the security of Israel, and this drew people from the right to support him. And
What do you think, Aaron?
No, I think that's right. I think the narrative came out of Camp David, a summit, by the way, that never should have taken place. And had we thought about it more and looked at the reasons Camp David, one, succeeded between Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat, realized that none of the factors for a successful agreement were there, we might have preempted some of this narrative. But I think there's a context here. The notion somehow that peacemaking in Israel has been the purview and the domain of the left or the center left is simply not accurate.
Right,
the history of peacemaking in Israel is a history of transformed hawks, beginning with Menachem Begin,
And Sharon is a perfect
who
example.
decided to trade Sinai to keep Jerusalem in the West Bank. Dalia's father, the breaker of bones during the first Intifada, was very, very, very tough. Sharon, the master architect of the settlement enterprise, was the only Israeli capable of dismantling it. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, the only Likud prime minister who has traded any West Bank territory in two interim agreements.
the Hebron Agreement.
Hebron Agreement and the Y River Memorandum. Tiny slice of the West Bank, but he earns the distinction, having vowed never to shake hands or deal with Arafat, to have done so and actually withdrawn from territory. So it's transformed hawks. If you combine that with Dalia's notion that Barack and, to a degree, Clinton, and we tried to make it clear to the president that if you go out and the president wanted to help Barack, who had made bold moves during that summit. Arafat had a different view of what Camp David was all about, but if you strip away the legitimacy of your partner and then it's followed by willful, purposeful, orchestrated violence, you're going to end up fundamentally delegitimizing not just the process, which had already received terrible body blows, but the nature of your interlocutor. And if you add to that the neighborhood in general, you begin to see...
Actually, the neighborhood is... now I want to get to the neighborhood, because I think that actually you could argue that in this conversation there's a certain airy-fairy quality, a lack of groundedness, at least somebody would argue that, I'm sure, given the chance. And that is that the right in Israel has always said, sure, maybe you can make a deal for a moment or two, but eventually the bad guys are going to take over. And if you make those deals and the bad guys take over, you'll be squeezed and you'll be in deep trouble. Now, here we are in the end of 2014, almost 4 years into what began as what people like to think of as an Arab Spring and is, in fact, a virtual disaster for the entire area. And I remember when I was still there in 2012, people were saying, thank God we didn't make peace with Syria. Otherwise, they'd be on the Golan Heights shooting down at us right now. So how do you respond to that? Aaron.
Look, I've studied and worked on this issue for a very long time, almost 40 years. Never have I seen a period in which there are more moving parts moving all at the same time in the wrong direction. And never have I seen a period in which it is no longer possible to hermetically seal the Israeli-Palestinian problem from the broader region. You simply can no longer do it. I mean, with Nusra on the Golan Heights, with Jordan now more vulnerable, with Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, the latest group in Egypt and Sinai to declare abeyance and fealty to Caliph Ibrahim, with Syria melting down, with the Israelis conflating Hamas and ISIS, you have the perfect storm for why an already risk-averse political establishment in Israel is going to grow inherently and increasingly more risk averse. And no number of talking points in the world crafted by diplomats who want to do the right thing and John Kerry and the president will somehow compete with what people see, feel, and sense. The sense of security is really gone.
Right.
Egypt and Israel have a very functional relationship, probably the best military to military and intelligence to intelligence security cooperation now than ever before. And the Jordanians and the Israelis are cooperating for obvious reasons. But the notion somehow that you now have an opportunity to make peace, not just with the Palestinians, but with 22 Arab countries, that whole notion, I think, has been stripped away from a transformation to a transaction. If it comes, if peace comes, and if I'd find another word other than peace, because the Israelis and the Arabs have never had it, and they don't have it now, it'll be a transaction. It'll be a business deal.
Right.
And you know, I'm not entirely persuaded, given the expectations that we had on that very hot day on September 13th on the White House lawn, where I was absolutely persuaded that the world had fundamentally been transformed. It wasn't sustainable, and we didn't understand why. And that's a cautionary tale. Doesn't mean giving up hope. I refuse to do that. I have a 34 and a 31-year-old. I'm not going to tell them never. We occupy a tiny space here for a very brief period of time, and we don't have the right to say never. Hope is critical, but illusions need to really be tested.
Dalia, I mean,
I agree. It's a different world today with the Muslims all over Europe. It has become an issue of the Western world. It's far beyond what it used to be 20 years ago. It's different. It's a different world.
I mean,
it's a different region. And this is exactly what my father used to say. We have a very, very small window of opportunity. Before Iran gets nuclear, he was talking about it in early 90s, and before the Muslims get more and more power in the world. And today, it's different. It's not a matter of right and left anymore.
I'm with you. But two issues I want to raise with you. One is the settlements.
The settlements.
Because it's one thing to say we need to hold tight, hold firm, not yield. And it's another thing to sort of expand one's civilian boundaries by settling civilians in those places and then making it impossible to leave. Can you imagine, do you believe it's possible for an Israeli government to remove most of the settlers or a portion of the settlers that would make it possible for it to be a Palestinian state, 80 or 90,000 settlers that they're talking about? Is it imaginable?
Yes, it is.
You think so?
Yes. It takes a very, very strong leader to do it. And it's getting much more complicated because there are many more settlements. But, you know, during the Oslo process, nobody was talking about uprooting settlements. And Ariel Sharon did it. And it feels that everybody knows what the end game should be. And adding more and more settlements and building more and more in East Jerusalem is just poking the fingers in the eyes of the Palestinians and inciting against them and making the peace further and much more difficult to achieve. But the day will come and we'll have to separate, and everybody is aware of it. But probably this is not the right time.
I mean, and do you think, Aaron, that it's actually imaginable that an Israeli government would come to power that could remove 90,000 people from their homes?
Sharon did.
Well, you have
He
precedent.
removed 9,000, and it was a disaster. I'm talking 90,000 after that failure, and failure costs.
You'd need at least two things. You'd need, the context would be, it's a dance of three, not one. You'd need a Palestinian partner, you need a deep Arab bench, and you need an American administration that was tough enough, fair enough, and respectful enough.
So we're 0 for 3 right now.
Right now you're 0 for 3, which is why there's more process than end game. I'll quote Larry Summers. I mentioned Ethan used earlier. Larry Summers once said to me that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. It took me about 30 minutes to figure out what he meant. It's a profound piece of philosophy. You don't wash rental cars because you care only about what you own. And the problem, it's a sad comment on the human enterprise, but nonetheless, there's an insufficient amount of ownership. And without ownership, local ownership, America's role is very limited.
We are getting questions from the audience and also those listening outside of here. I'm going to continue our conversation for just a few more minutes, and then we'll get to the audience questions, okay? I wanted to ask you, Aaron, because I know that you've just written this book about leadership, and also you've been a close observer of administrations, to talk a little bit about the Obama administration's efforts in the Middle East, and also, you know, the issue of Iran. I mean, I don't want to overload this question, but I mean, we do have what Israel considers to be an enormously existential risk there.
Yeah.
And yet, as was on the front page of our paper, I think today, if not yesterday, I can't remember, a story that says that in essence, Iran and the United States are in alliance in their fight against the Islamic State.
Yeah. The Obama, look, I'll quote Crosby, Stills, and Nash here.
Okay.
Life's about learning, and I think this president has learned quite a bit. He's moved from a putative transformer, which he thought he could be, both in terms of transforming the American political situation and transforming America's foreign policy, to being what I call a transactor, which is far more realistic given the challenges that we face. And I think he has, unlike John Kerry, I think he's very cautious and very risk-averse when it comes to dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think he had all kinds of hopes. I was told by people who claim to know that this time it was going to be different, that this was going to be a president who was going to be tough and firm, and
When he came in 2009?
and he could deliver. And you remember that first year and a half, on some of his advice, he decided to have an unproductive fight with Israel. Let me be clear. You don't do Arab-Israeli peace without fighting with the Israelis. That's clear. The only three breakthroughs in this entire 50-year peace process, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, all came as a consequence of tough wrangles with the Israelis. The question is not whether you fight with the Israelis. Of course you're going to fight with them, and the Arabs too. The question is whether the fights are productive. That's the key. Kissinger had a productive fight with your father over the second disengagement agreement and the reassessment. Carter had fights with Menachem Begin. And Bush 41 and Baker had all kinds of fights with Shamir. And yet, at the end of the day, each of them produced what you have now is a dysfunctional, functionless relationship between the United States and Israel at an institutional level, as witnessed yesterday by Congress's passing of the partnership agreement. The relationship is extremely close, resilient, and quite productive. But at the top, it is without a doubt, it is the most dysfunctional relationship between an Israeli prime minister and an American president in the history of the U.S. Israel relationship. And unlike the other dysfunctional relationships, Begin and Carter, Bush 41 and Shamir, it doesn't produce anything. And this is essentially is a huge problem. Now, I just want one other point, because it has to deal with, it deals with your father. The relationship between your father and Bill Clinton was one of the most extraordinary relationships. I couldn't figure it. I witnessed some of it. The grieving in the wake of your father's assassination, the respect and admiration and love that President Clinton had for him. And I mentioned earlier, he writes in his memoirs, an American president writes in his memoirs that he loved Rabin as he had loved no other man. It's an extraordinary expression. Your father offered the president a historical moment, and he treasured it and cherished it.
I think there was another point. The negotiations were bilateral, Israel-Palestine. And my father did not expect the Americans to be too much involved and productive.
He tried to keep us out, actually.
Right. He was expecting you just to give us the grounds to meet and not to be directly involved. And this was something very significant, I think, that kept the relationship where it was. Clinton did not have any change with Barack. In Barack's time, Clinton was totally involved and supportive of the Israelis, which made him suspicious to the other side. They couldn't trust him because he was totally taken by Barack.
Well, that was, in part, that was part of our problem as well. Trust me on this one. I mean, we tried to get Clinton not to take every phone call that Barack made. I mean, your father would never have called the president.
I was told that my father used to talk to Clinton once a month, once in 2 months, and Barack used to talk to him 5 times a day.
Exactly, and no, that's, yeah,
right.
You know, Arafat was
true.
the most frequent visitor to the Oval Office in the year 2000. This was and I have great respect for President Clinton. He cared more about this process, I think, than any other American president, but it was a case of Bill Clinton and the Arabs and Israelis he loved too much. You have to maintain a sense of distance.
Right.
So actually,
and detachment if you want to be effective. Your father and your father would never have called the president the number of times that Barack did.
Well, so, I mean, one of the questions from Cincinnati, Ohio, we have other people listening in, is can you distill why this administration and the Netanyahu government are so antagonistic toward one another? So you said you need to have some detachment. I'd say President Obama is pretty detached.
He is, and that's, yeah, he is.
So that doesn't seem like the main source of the problem.
No, but
here.
detachment is fine, but it has to be accompanied by something else. And, you know, I thought this through. I think Barack Obama was 6 years old during the 1967 war, which is an extraordinary fact. I mean, it's a generational change. That war, and again, I'm only reporting here. I'm not trying to create an editorial comment. That war literally contained most of the pro-Israeli narratives, myths, and tropes that mobilized both the American Jewish community and the non-Jewish community in this country. Barack Obama missed all that. In fact, his entire career, being quote-unquote good on Israel, was really not that important. And frankly, I watched his two predecessors deal with the Israelis, Clinton's love for Rabin, and even George W. Bush, who had an admiration for Sharon. That famous helicopter ride when Bush was governor. And they're flying over Israel's narrow waist, and Bush blurts out to Sharon, who was in the helicopter, "We got driveways in Texas, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Minister, that's longer than this country is wide." That longer than this country is wide, driveways in Texas,
this is the essence.
That comment comes from a sense of intuitive bonding. Now, many critics of Israel will say that the last thing we need in the U.S. Israel relationship is more of that. We have to be tough. But the reality is, you know, let's be clear, great powers are great powers, but if we think we're going to somehow impose and tell the Arabs and the Israelis what to do, we're not thinking clearly.
But that isn't really the reason that the relationship is so bad.
Well, no, but I guess my point is, from Netanyahu's perspective, you have a president who, in the prime minister's view, is bloodless when it comes to Israel. And from Obama's view, you have the perception of a prime minister who I think the president believes is essentially, I'll say it flat out, I'm not running for anything anymore, a con man. That in essence, you have a prime minister who only thinks about his own political interests and needs, won't accept any reciprocity when it comes to accepting and acknowledging what American interests are. And they don't have a common enterprise on which to work.
But your honesty of the word con man is through President Obama's mouth. Are you saying this?
You mean, do I think that the Prime Minister of Israel is a con man?
That's what I'm asking.
I think the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, is a product of a set of conflicts and experiences which has created a man who in many respects is at war with himself. My own view, Bibi is at war with Netanyahu. The tough-talking Likud pal whose wife, brother-in-law, and martyred brother were much tougher than he is, and father, is at war with a man, now the second longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history other than Ben-Gurion, who wants to be, but can't be, a great leader. And his mission is not to be the midwife or husband of a Palestinian state. It's to liberate Israel from the shadow of the Iranian bomb. And this produces, I think, an enormous amount of conflict.
Do you want to say anything about? No, you don't. You certainly don't. No. The Rabin Center does rely on the government, so we'll have to respect that.
No, you have to understand where he comes from and to read about his father.
Sure. But that tells you about the right-wing side and the tough Jabotinsky side.
His inability to do things.
Oh, I see.
It's very important to look at the person's background and what binds him to what, to what values. And that's it. So far.
So I don't know if this is another somewhat political question that I'll pose to you, Dalia, from Binghamton, which is, what do you think would happen to the two-state solution and to peace if the proposed law that is now got partway going but is now in abeyance as elections come up, of the nation-state of the Jewish people law, if it passed? What do you think, what effect would it have, the questioner is asking, on the two-state solution and on peace?
The effect, the most prominent effect will be on the Israeli society, not on the two-state solution.
Yes, but it may affect that too. But you're right, it's mostly on Israel.
It's a tremendous revolution because it's against the Declaration of Independence of Israel. It's making Israel a place for Jews only. It's very, 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 I was very, very concerned about this law. And I think he himself was about to raise a lighter, more moderate version.
More watered down.
But then when he decided that he wants to blow up everything, then he brought the version of the right-wingers in Likud, and this caused the whole turmoil that brought about him to declare election. So it's all about politics, and this law, I really can pray that will never pass.
Aaron, here's a question that I thought maybe you'd want to address. It's from a member of the audience here. Specifically, what were the issues that caused the failure of the recent peace talks under John Kerry?
There are three basic missing ingredients. You give them to me, and maybe you could get close to an agreement. Number one, you don't have leaders who are prepared to pay the price of what an agreement will cost. And while I respect the fact that everyone, quote unquote, knows the outcome, that's not the issue. The issue is how to get there. And that requires a degree of will and skill that is simply not evident, either on the Israeli or Palestinian side. So it's the absence of leadership. Number two, the gaps between issues, not all of the issues, but of the 6 core issues that drive the conflict: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people in a peace negotiation, and the end of conflict and claims. On these 6 issues, and all other issues are subordinate to these 6, you simply have gaps that are right now and during the Kerry effort were impossible to bridge. There's a myth that came out of Camp David which is just wrong. And it was a myth designed to validate both the American and the Israeli behavior at Camp David. And that was that we were, if I hear this one more time, that we were this close to an agreement at Camp David. It's an urban legend. It's worse than that. It's a fundamental distortion of reality. We were this close to an agreement at Camp David. And I can't get my arms out any further. I was one of the 12 or so people who were there. Not this close. And although much work has been done in the last 15 years, the gaps are still enormous. And finally, again, I'll say it, you do not have in Washington an administration, I'll be very unkind here, because it purported to think it knew what it was doing, that knows what it's doing on this particular issue. I mean, I will go back to the last effective mediation effort we ran. Now, granted, it was on a procedural issue getting to Madrid, but Bush and Baker understood what to do. They understood the relationship between means and ends. They knew that you needed an ample dose of vinegar with both sides, but you also needed honey as well. And you just don't have that in Washington. And
you
so
really think if we had it would be doable now?
If you have the 3 ingredients, leaders willing to act.
The leaders not just in Washington, but
no
there.
doubt that nowadays we won't be able to do it bilateral. We need a third-party intervention.
Of course, but we've had a third party engaged and it didn't work, right? I mean, it's not been going too well.
No, but I've said this before, and I don't mean to trivialize, but the peace process is like rock and roll. It really won't die. And I say that not to suggest that or to trivialize the seriousness of the situation, but we are stuck now in a kind of Bermuda Triangle between a 2-state solution that we cannot implement and a 2-state solution that's too important to abandon. It is the least worst outcome for this particular problem.
But it does feel like, for the first time in many years, almost a majority of people on both sides of the conflict don't believe it can happen or will happen, and the leaders are talking about it less and less. So, I mean, I know you're from Cleveland and you believe in rock and roll, but...
Indeed I do. Yes.
Anyway, I mean, I think it's an important... Let me ask you something else, though, which is we were talking a little bit earlier about how every member of the peace team was Jewish. And at one point, you sort of wondered whether that was such a brilliant move. If you're willing, for a minute or two, to talk about it, because there is something both, there's the love part, there's the, you know that they care about Israel anyway, and because they care about Israel, they care about that they believe that a 2-state solution is vital to Israel, all of those things. But has it been a deficit, do you think, on some way?
It's an interesting question. I love rock and roll, so I'll go back to Michael Jackson. It was Michael Jackson who said that if you want to make a change, the place to start is by looking in the mirror. And I've done a lot of looking in the mirror over the last 15 years since I left government. I think that in essence, and I've said this publicly, it's a phrase that I've become associated with, even though it's Kissinger's, that we function far too often as Israel's lawyer. Now, I raised this notion for Baker, and he loved it. He thought this was I'm not going to be, don't ask me to be Israel's lawyer. I'm not going to be Israel's lawyer. But the truth is, the way we behave, now, if Dennis were here, we'd probably have an argument about this, but that's okay.
The man is sick, and you don't mind.
In essence, we pursued policies that made it very difficult for the United States to play the role of a truly detached mediator. Now, you can push this to a point. We don't have a neutral relationship with the State of Israel. We have a special relationship. When Kissinger, Carter, and Baker used that special relationship to their advantage, they got somewhere. We have allowed the special relationship, I think, to become exclusive. And I'm a proponent of this relationship because I believe in negotiations, in this notion of the paradox of the partial mediator. It is our partiality to Israel that makes us relevant. If we didn't have Israel's trust and confidence, there would have been no Kissinger, Carter, and Baker. Nothing. And particularly at Camp David. And Carter ignored the advice of many of his advisors and took Sam Lewis's, which was to essentially try to work with Begin. And even though the relationship got very rocky, Carter bought into it. So it is that special relationship that gives us our capacity to play the role we do when we decide to look at the U.S. Israel relationship in the right way. I wrote this down in an op-ed for the Washington Post, and Clinton was the only president that I couldn't interview for my last book because he was very angry at this notion that he had behaved as Israel's lawyer. But I don't think there's any other way to describe it.
But it's paradoxical because on the one hand you're saying that's what gives us our relevance and our power. On the other hand, you're saying we mustn't act like they're lawyers. So it seems a very fine.
Yes, it is fine. Separate special relationship, which is functional, from an exclusive relationship where we abandon our independence as a mediator. We have a no surprise policy.
I don't think it has to do with being Jews or not. It's the special relationship between United States and Israel since long ago.
True.
Maybe it's up to the Jews that vote for president here, but
well, there aren't enough of them to make a difference, so it's not from the votes.
But this is why, after the Six-Day War, my father writes in his biography, the morning after, he said, I'm taking off my uniform and I'm going to be ambassador to the United States because I believe that this is the key to solve the problem in the region. The United States is our potential ally to make peace here. And this he writes in his biography, 67.
Sure.
So
but let me ask you both
something in the
this.
relationship and not just, you cannot look at it from the Jewish point of view.
Let me ask you both this. If Kerry's efforts, which we know ended in failure, do you think that he should be held responsible for that? Do you think that it was a bad idea, that he should have understood? Because I know from my exposure to Kerry when he was a senator and I was over there for the Times, and we would get together when he came by, he was very enthusiastic about solving this problem. And I would always say to him, you know, Senator, it's not that easy. They're not that eager. Either side, neither side has suffered enough to make the sacrifices needed to cut a deal. And I felt that he really wanted to do it, and I'm not sure that trying and failing is better than not trying.
Well,
what do you think?
Well, it's funny you should mention this because during the second briefing of President Clinton, the final one before Camp David, and by the way, we briefed the president we briefed the president after we had issued the invitations. So it wasn't as if there was any other alternative but to go. But he said to us, you know, trying and failing is better than not trying at all. And I thought I was really moved and motivated because that's so quintessentially American. But it is not a substitute for the foreign policy of the greatest nation on earth. It's a more appropriate slogan for a high school or a college football team.
Right.
You cannot, because failure, look, in life, what's the world's most compelling ideology? It's not democracy, it's not nationalism, and it's not even capitalism. It's success. Success is the world's most compelling ideology because success breeds power, constituents, followers, and failure breeds the opposite. Failure costs, it's not just we'll try again, or Bill Clinton's famous expression, I'm not ashamed to be caught trying. No, I don't fault Kerry for trying. I don't, because I don't think it was ever within his capacity, given the odds arrayed against him, to succeed. It's trying smartly.
I'm confused. It wasn't in his capacity to succeed,
no,
but you don't blame him.
I don't blame Kerry for why we don't have an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. Your question was,
my question is, but
should
do
we
you
blame him for even trying?
For knowing,
the answer is,
for going in naively.
No, because nobody, including his boss, really believed that this was going to work. And it was done at a time when there were so many other moving parts in this region. And the president stayed away from it. There was a brief moment in March where it might have appeared that things were getting closer, and you saw a in fact, your colleague Mark Landwehr broke the story, that the president and the White House wanted to identify itself with what might have been a success. But no, it's not like that. And I think a lot of respect for John Kerry, the Energizer Bunny of American foreign policy, for trying to put himself in the middle of the mix, which he's done on 100 different issues.
Okay. We have only a minute or two left, and I'm going to ask you the last question, Dalia, and thank the audience for being so terrific. I guess, you know, I want to get a sense from you, given how volatile and troubled the region is today, whether it really is a moment to ask Israel to cut a deal that would end up with it reducing its territory and taking enormous risks. Is this the good moment to ask that of them?
Right now?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
I'm not sure. I think that we should negotiate. We should keep talking. We should keep the channels open. We have to show that we are willing to go somewhere, that there can be, that over the rainbow there is hope and there is a solution. And I think the biggest mistake is not talking. Is this?
But the other side will say, I'm not interested in talking just for talking, Dalia. I'm here because we're going to cut a deal. And you're telling me you're not really sure you want to cut a deal right now. What am I talking to you for?
I am talking to you because I want to cut a deal. I don't know whether right now we can come to terms. As Aaron said before, there are too many gaps and too many issues which are in dispute. But let's try and solve some of them. Let's keep the channels open, because at the end of the day, we'll have to do something here. It cannot go on forever like this. So right now, I think both sides are not ready to cut a deal, but they should try and keep on trying to make progress.
Okay, and on that extremely optimistic note, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank our two wonderful panelists.